This afternoon's panel is entitled Expressions of State Policy in the Gulf. I'm Professor Jeff Macris from Yale University. Today we have three papers being presented. The first paper will be from Dr. Gadi Hitman from Ariel University, a paper entitled Gulf States Policy Towards Syrian Refugees, Charity Before Hospitality. Gadi Hitman is a faculty member in the Middle East Department and Political Science at Ariel University. His recent articles focus on the Arab Spring, its implications on the Middle East region, among it, aspects of nationalism in different Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, Libya, and Syria, gender rights, Gulf states foreign policy, and Arab world ties with Israel. Our second paper is entitled Qatar, the Rift, and the Future of Gulf States Cooperation. Our presenters are Dr. Edward Lynch from Hollins University and Dr. Sonja Taylor from George Mason University. Dr. Edward Lynch is professor and chair of political science at Hollins University in Roanoke. He's the author of two forthcoming books on the MENA region. And Dr. Sonja Taylor teaches international relations classes at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. Taylor leads study abroad programs to Australia, France, Oman, Qatar, and Switzerland, and is a fellow with the National Council on U.S. and Arab Relations. And then the third paper is entitled Social Cohesion, International Legitimacy, and Electoral Integrity in Kuwait. Professor Yuree is a presenter from Rhode Island College. She is an assistant professor of political science and a research fellow at Harvard University's Middle East Initiative, where she helps lead the Kuwait Public Policy Opinions Project. Her research interests include authoritarian politics and gender equality. She received her PhD from UCLA and BA from Washington University in St. Louis. And she also spent a semester at the AUC. So we'll proceed with having the presenter present their paper, their presentation, and then once all three are done, then we'll open up to discussion and questions. So, Professor Hitman, to you, sir.
Thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. First, and I want to apologize for my voice. I'm a little bit chilly, but I think that I can make it in less than 15 minutes. Sometimes the headline speaks for itself. And one of the biggest paradox that I saw during the Arab Spring era was how come the Arab states, the well-known richest Arab states of the Gulf, do not open the borders for millions of refugees from Syrians? Why? And it was amazing to look, for example, in Google Scholar, see that nobody, maybe one or two people wrote about it before 2016. And that's make me, that's raise the questions, if nobody writes about it, how come the media is so full with reports every day of what's going on the ground? You can look at the first slide of my presentation, you can see exactly the story. You see the Arab on the shore, you see the refugee, and you see the flag that sent him to Europe, to the EU, while there are sharks on the water. So what's going on between the Arab Gulf states and Syria? And I move forward to show you two slides from the official website of the Syrian Central Bureau of Statistics. The other thing was that when I tried to collect the datas and to realize how many Syrians left Syria since 2011 up to 2016, when I wrote the paper, 2017, I couldn't find the numbers because if you look on the slides, you can see here, I'll go to show you because I have to go to show. If you see here, the number, this is the number of 25,582 Syrians today. Well, we know that there is no chance that there are 25 million Syrians today living in Syria, which means that the Central Statistics Bureau in Damascus keep counting everyone who is born in Syria, and they are not decrease the numbers of the refugees. If you go to Jordan, try to understand how many people, how many refugees, Syrian refugees you have in Jordan, you get different amounts between 1.5 to 2 million refugees. And the numbers are very high, and there are very important ramifications and consequences on the Jordanian economy, for example. So it was pretty hard to collect the data to understand what's going on the ground. The third thing that was problematic methodologically was that every time when I write the Central Statistics Bureau of Saudi Arabia, I couldn't get in access. And the same thing happened with Qatar or UAE. For each country for its own reasons. And when I did succeed to collect the numbers, I immediately photoed it. And just to keep it in my computer to see how it goes. So if I go forward, I'll start from the beginning, and it will take me no more than 10 minutes. What you see on the screen now is a picture from 1951. In 1951, the world signed about the National Covenant of Refugees. What is interesting is no Arab states ever signed on this treaty. And the reason is very simple. In 1951, no Arab state was willing to sign on that contract because everybody believed that the Palestinian refugees will go back to 1948 borders within Israel. So signing on this treaty in 1951 politically meant that if we are signing and tomorrow we have refugees, we have to take care of them as refugees. The only unique case was, of course, Jordan, that in 1948 gave them citizenship, but King Abdullah I didn't do it because he was in fond of the Palestinians, but because he had a new state and he had to build it, and he forced powerful labor force work to establish a new Jordanian nation state. When he had at that time 25,000 Bedouins, and that's it. When you have more than 500,000 people from Israel or from the British Mandate of Palestine you give them citizenship, and they are building the states for you. And if I move forward, this is the story that all of you have known. And this is the famous picture of the Syrian baby who died in the sea, and his body was founded on the shore, and of course the father with the. But just to remind you what's going on. So what they basically did, they closed the borders, and as Islam obey, they made charity before hospitality, because if you have money, you can give charity, and as far as you can give the charity away from your borders, it's good. Therefore, we saw that's what happened since 2015, when the question of Syrian refugees took the intention of all the international community and the regional states in the Middle East. And there are several reasons why this takes place. What they did is international conferences, just as we're sitting today here in ASMEA, and they managed to raise support at that time when I wrote the paper at sum of $4 billion US. Today it's even more than that, because they have money and they don't have any problem to support to Syrian refugees in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey, and elsewhere. And you can see the pictures when I move forward. And now let's go to the reason. I'll go back to the former slide later on. I managed to find 5 different reasons, and this was the hardcore of my study. The first one was that when the civil war in Syria started, surprisingly, all 6 Arab Gulf states were not in the same position. UAE, for example, and Oman didn't want to cut ties with Bashar Assad's regime. Furthermore, in 2015, Sultan Qaboos of Oman offered himself as a mediator between Assad and the opposition. At that time, when people asked him to open the door for refugees, he said, I cannot accept refugees, because if I accept refugees, it means that I'm not satisfied with Assad's performances. And if I want to help Assad, I cannot open the border for them. So we saw different positions. So I have to take the water for a second, just because I'm too chill. I'm sorry. And same story what was with UAA. The second reason was undermining the demographic balance, and I will go back now to the slide before. Look at that slide, but this is only a short example of what's going on the ground in the Gulf states. And I have some data here that I collected during my flights from Tel Aviv to Toronto and from Toronto to Washington. For example, I believe you all know that in Qatar, for example, we are talking about 2.8 million people. 88.4% of them are foreigners, non-residents. In Bahrain, the proportion are almost alike, 1.5 million people, half of them non-Bahrain citizens. In UAE, United Arab Emirates, 9 million people, 90% foreigners. And in Oman, for example, we have a community of 400,000 people who are originally from Iran, which means that if I want to go and to engage with Assad, I might take the risk to engage with Iran. And if they have such a amount of Iranians in Oman, I would think twice. Should I confront Assad or not? And what you see here on the slide is what I took from UAI and what I took from Omanis, and you can see the numbers. And when you read the Gulf newspapers at that time, you realized that the journalists all over the Gulf states media called the Syrian refugees, I remind you, all of you, they are all Arabs, they call them strangers. They call them foreigners. In Arabic, they call them ajanib. Ajanib in Arabic means that you are a stranger or not. And they explained they are Arabs, but they are not Arabs like us. They are other Arabs. And we do not want them in Saudi, and we do not want them in Kuwait or elsewhere. You just pick up the state, because they might go crazy because the weather in the desert. They are not familiar with the weather in the desert. So it's better for them to go to Europe because there is snow in Damascus in the winter. That's how they speak, that's how they write. Amazing. So this was the second reason. The third one was quite astonishing, that people basically from Saudi said we are not in a good economic position right now. We cannot absorb refugees from Syria. It's better for them to go to Germany. Angela Merkel can take care of them. One of the prominent journalists in Saudi that wrote about it was Adnan Khashoggi. Back in 2016, it was amazing to read. Saudi Arabia has no money to take some, let's say, 500,000 Syrians. That's but this is not the only case in the Gulf states. I talked earlier about ethnic diversity. We are Arab and they are Arab. Well, we are different Arabs. And last but not least, of course, terror threats. If you all remember, if you don't remember, I am here to remind you that all Gulf states were experienced terror attacks since 2011, and Bahrain itself had some popular resistance in February 2011, and without the interference of the Saudi Arabi army to protect the Sunni minority regime in Manama. I wonder where all of us could be today. So this is the final results. You can see the Syrians children happy in. This is from Jordan, but you can also find it in Turkey and in Lebanon, and the outcome was that they gave a huge amounts of money to support them in the winter or in the summer, education, welfare, infrastructure, and etc. So charity comes before hospitality. We have our own problems. We don't need the Syrian refugees. And in a more theoretical overview, if I may, I think we can say that we should ask ourselves as scholars something about Arab solidarity nowadays. And one of the prominent conclusions that I can conclude from my research is that today in 2019, actually even before, but today in 2019, Arab nation state prevails Arab nationalism. And we cannot talk about if we ever could talk about Arab nationalism, not about Ummah by the words of a community of believers, religiously talking. If we talk about political Ummah, one united community, I think in 2019 we cannot talk about it. We can talk about nation states. Each state has its own interests, and the Syrian refugee problems is not the problem of the Gulf states, not to mention other states that they cannot afford them to absorb them. And if I mentioned earlier, some 2 million refugees in Jordan and 1.5 in Lebanon, think about Lebanon nowadays, what it means for them that they have to, and they don't have the money to, if they don't have the money to take care of their own people, how can they take care of those refugees? And it's not going to be better in the future. Thank you.
I'm Edward Lynch. I'm co-presenting this paper with Dr. Sonja Taylor, my co-presenter, and it is based in large part on interviews that we did in Doha just about 11 months ago. We traveled there with a delegation from the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, and one of the major efforts of that trip was to understand the rift. The last 2 years have seen some extraordinary diplomatic activity in the Gulf region, and in the summer of 2017, 4 Arabic-speaking nations, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt, cut off all diplomatic, economic, and cultural ties with Qatar. So that is the topic of the paper. We begin with some theoretical background on international organizations and international organization theory, noting that particularly in the aftermath of the Second World War and the perceived responsibility of chauvinistic nationalism for the horrors of that war, there was great hope and great expectations about international organizations reducing, if not eventually completely overcoming, national sovereignty. The idea was that international organizations would be more effective, they would be useful, they would, in a sense, take sovereignty. If you think about Gulliver on the beach in Lilliput, they would take sovereignty and tie it down one thread at a time, a functional organization here, a resolved civil war over there, a mediation effort over here, and that eventually sovereignty would have so many of these threads attached that Gulliver would not be able to rise again. What is usually left out of that image is that the only reason the Lilliputians were able to do that is because Gulliver was unconscious. When national sovereigns aren't unconscious, when they're very, very familiar that their freedom of action is being limited, even slowly but surely, they tend to assert themselves from time to time just to let everybody know, their own people, their fellow national leaders, and the international organizations, that they have no intention of subordinating their national interests entirely, or even in a majority sort of fashion, to international organizations. So that's the theoretical background. And in addition, another part of that was, well, if global international organizations will not do the job of tying down sovereignty and reducing or overcoming national interests, maybe regional organizations can do that. And that brought us to the Gulf Cooperation Council, which was founded in 1981. If any regional organization should be able to create a common cause and a common collaborative action, it should be a group like the Gulf Cooperation Council. After all, it has a relatively small membership, so a relatively homogeneous membership, and it has a single large power, Saudi Arabia, which again, in theory, should be able to guide the organization in a sort of coherent and a straightforward sort of way. So so the bottom line here is, if national interests are not going to be subordinated to international organizations, global organizations, maybe regional organizations, maybe rather small regional organizations, maybe regional organizations with a relatively homogeneous membership. So that's the proposition that we're testing with this paper, and we're using the rift as our test case. So the paper kind of shifts back and forth between an academic consideration of the theory, which draws on a number of academic sources, and then when we get into the rift itself, more of the sources are interviews that we did when we were in Doha and other non-academic sort of journalistic sources. So just a word on sources. The rift between Qatar and its neighbors in 2017 did not come out of nowhere. There were a number of disputes between Qatar and its neighbors prior to that, the details of which we talk about in the paper. These basically fell into two categories: ongoing problems and then problems leading up to 2017. Some of the ongoing problems really had to do, at least in Qatar's case, with the determination on the part of the Qatari emir, and particularly the father of the current emir, that they were going to move out of the shadow of Saudi Arabia. They were going to assert their own foreign policy. They drew the conclusion even earlier than that, in the early 1990s, after the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein in 1990, that Saudi Arabia could not protect its fellow Arab states. And in fact, Saudi Arabia was threatened, or at least felt threatened, by Saddam Hussein enough to permit a huge foreign military presence on its soil in 1990, 1991, and even continuing into the 2000s. So Qatar realized, or its leadership concluded after that, Saudi Arabia can't protect us, so we have to find another protector. And they decided that that protector was going to be the United States, or that partner, I should say, was going to be the United States. And so the word that we kept hearing in Doha was that Qatar rebranded itself as a friend of the United States, or at the very least a partner of the United States in the Gulf region. This was one ongoing issue between it and some of its fellow Gulf states. The extraordinary success of Al Jazeera since it was launched in the early 2000s was also an ongoing issue. The widespread perception that Al Jazeera is a mouthpiece for the Qatari government. We were at the headquarters of Al Jazeera. They, of course, denied this up one wall and down the other and gave evidence of their independence. But the plain fact of the matter is that their editorial slant usually follows the line of the Qatari government preferences, even if not every story, even if not every interview, even if not every guest. As our speaker put it last night, and I think he's probably right about this, they don't have the emir on the phone saying this is how you'll cover the story, but they hire people who are likely to more or less follow that Qatari government line. Again, this was an ongoing issue. In 2013, the three Gulf nations who severed relations in 2017 severed relations, diplomatic relations, not in quite as comprehensive a way, but they did sever their diplomatic relations over what their fellow Gulf states called internal interference. They didn't like some of the things on Al Jazeera. They didn't like some of the sermons that were being broadcast. They certainly did not like Qatar's funding of the Muslim Brotherhood and of Hamas. That rift was resolved relatively quickly compared to the current one. But then as the Arab Spring caught fire, Qatar saw a number of opportunities to assert its independence from Saudi Arabia, intervening in Libya, intervening in Syria, intervening in Bahrain, criticizing the joint UAE Saudi Arabia intervention in Bahrain. This led, along with the ongoing issues, along with the accusations of support for terrorist groups, so-called Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, to the severing of relations in 2017. This was far more comprehensive. The rift nations, as they're sometimes called, closed their airspace. They withdrew their ambassadors. They stopped their economic relations with Qatar. They required all of their nationals to come back within, 48 hours, something like that. All the Qatari nationals in those four states had to go home. This disrupted families. In some cases, there were generations of intermarriage that were disrupted by this. And the rift nations presented Qatar with a set of 13 demands and gave them, again, a very, very short time to respond to all 13 of these demands, leading to the ongoing crisis and the ongoing situation that is still in place. And most people at the beginning thought that this would be resolved relatively quickly. We are 2.5 years in, and except for some very small steps, which we'll mention at the end of our presentation this afternoon, there's been no movement in this at all. So Dr. Taylor will talk about some of the results of the rift and some of the efforts that Qatar has made since then. Dr. Taylor?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lynch. So the stories of what happened in the past have already been explained, but one thing I'd like to point out is that several times, especially the Saudis would tell Doha, well, we're upset at you for the incidents that have happened, so we're going to withdraw our ambassadors from Doha. So this happened at least twice before we get to what is called the Big Rift. But before, something happened in April of 2017 that really upset a lot of the members of the GCC, and that was rumors leaked into the news that Qatar had paid over $1 billion to some militants, both from Iran and Syria, for the release of some of their 26 national, including family members, that were falcon hunting. And they paid this release for them to get free after being held hostage for 16 months. So 3 months later, just out of the blue, they get this notice that we're going to have these sanctions on you without any, they caught everyone red-handed. No one expected it. But they didn't get the list of demands of what to do until 17 days later. So it was even more confusing. But we had 3 of the GCC states supporting the sanctions, as well as mentioned Egypt, but there were also 11 other countries that went along with it. The 2 countries from the GCC that did not were Kuwait and Oman, and Kuwait immediately said, we'll try to help mediate as much as possible, good offices. Oman tried to publicly stay neutral, but certainly helped out with ports and shipments of goods and transportations. So the GCC's goal, what they thought, is we're going to impose these sanctions, and Doha is going to fall down on its knees and beg mercy, but basically they just ignored the deeds and just came up with their own plans of what to do. So as mentioned, the land borders were blocked, which was very important because they only had 1% domestic production of agricultural goods, and 4/5 came from, the food came from their neighbors, mostly across the borders that were now closed. Ports were closed and airspace was closed. So when the 13 demands on the list came down 2 weeks later, they included closing Al Jazeera News, reducing ties with Iran, shutting down Turkey's military base, which was about 50 kilometers south of Doha. And Qatar replied that their demands were unrealistic, and of course they are doing a lot to stop terrorism, especially with Syrian refugees. And so what did other countries do that did not participate in the sanctions? A number of them called for immediate negotiations, and that includes Turkey, Russia, and Iran. And Iran was very helpful. They share an oil field with Doha, so it was in their best interest for all economic goods to continue, but they sent ships and planes with food and supplies so they could continue their industry and feed the people. The United States gets more interesting because the day that the sanctions are announced, President Trump tweets that it was his idea because he's for supporting stopping terrorism, so therefore he sided with the Saudis and the sanctions. But the Secretaries of State and Defense had to come to try to salvage diplomacy and keep talks open with the GCC and Qatar, because we have the largest base in the Middle East in Qatar, and it's very important for strikes in Islamic states, so it was in our best interest to keep things going. President Trump actually manages to offer to everyone go to Camp David, and that offer is denied. So then the White House came forward and said, well, why don't you just come here and we'll hold talks? But the emir from Qatar said he didn't want to leave at that particular point. The UN actually gets involved, sending some people to interview members of civil society and the government to see what the impact is, and they, half a year later, sent a report saying that it's causing material and moral damage to the citizens of the country. So the Qataris, as mentioned, they take action, and the first thing that they do is they get Iran to open their airspace so they can continue flying in and out of the region. They reroute their airline system, and they made plans economically and strategically to move forward. Because they're such a wealthy country, they were able to pump a lot of money. Some estimates are as high as $300 billion to keep the economy going, the banking system, their currency stable, and they were able to help pay for contracts and other impacts that people had or businesses had. They reached out diplomatically, especially to the West, and there was a big campaign going on. Interestingly enough, Israel and the Saudis and the UAE lobbying the US to close the military bases, so they were trying to counter that as well. They also created a permanent residency visa, which is unusual and the only one in the Gulf. And then they had some economic policies. I don't know if any of you are familiar, but the most successful one was their dairy production that they had. Government came up with a plan to feed their people and took over a sheep farm and brought in over 4,000 dairy cows, mostly from America. Today there's over 25,000 dairy cows, and within a year they were self-sustaining their own citizens. Today they're exporting to 5 different countries, and this week Malaysia and Doha have signed an agreement that they'll help build a dairy production in Malaysia to be the largest in that area. They also announced that they're going to have an IPO and hopefully raise $400 billion. So that's pretty good in less than 3 years. Trade increased in the region. In Oman, it went up over 144%. And they also had increased business with both Pakistan and Iran and Kuwait and Turkey, which wasn't the goal of what the GCC sanctions were supposed to be doing. Financially, though, most interesting, the year of the rift started, their GDP continued to grow at 1.7%, and last year it was increased to 2.2%. They have the highest credit rating in the Gulf region, and banking has continued to do very well. Their food, they're self-sufficient. The only negative thing is real estate prices have decreased. On a more positive side, strategic ties with the United States have never been better militarily. The Doha's government is giving $2 billion to help make the US air base even better. And Turkey has gotten closer relations. They sent more troops and have been doing joint military exercises with the Qatari military. And Iran, of course, has gotten even closer with them. And we can't forget that the World Cup is coming in 2022. And so it's a lot of building and construction is going on. So other results unexpected is the Emir is like their superhero now. If you go to Doha, you will see his image everywhere, on the sides of buildings, on cars. They think that he's done a remarkable job, and they're very proud of their country and their Emir. It's also created a social identity of that they're Qataris as opposed to more of their tribal regional identity that they had before. So some other things, kind of the demands. Al Jazeera is not promoting more pro-democracy movement in the region as they were before, and Qatar has stopped supporting Hamas. They're supporting international organizations, but not that organization directly. So some more interesting things this week. Qatar went to the UN Security Council and said, you must do something to end this rift. It's against the UN Charter. It's violating international laws, international human rights, and violating the Charter and anything for the UN standing for peaceful resolutions. So did Qatar win in this case? Well, yes, economically they did because they were so wealthy. If they didn't have that wealth, how would things have turned out? Probably not as rosy. Politically, some people say the reason that they didn't have any military action or coup was because the US base and Turkey base being in there. So the dispute is bringing to threats to regional and international organizations. But most interesting, on Wednesday, 5 Gulf states have joined the United States in joining sanctions against Iran banks and individuals. And of course, they include the UAE, the Saudis, Bahrain, and of course, Qatar. So now I'll turn it over to Dr. Lynch to summarize.
If a country as small and with a small population as Qatar, even with its large income, even with having the highest per capita income in the world, thanks to its natural gas, if they can not only not be coerced, but actually benefit as they have, as Dr. Taylor pointed out, that goes to not only the future of international organizations and how much success they're going to have coercing any state into doing something they really don't want to, but it demonstrates that national interest is still a thing in international relations. It goes to your point about Arab nationalism as opposed to Arab solidarity. And I think for the 4 rift states who have probably suffered more than Qatar in all of this, it demonstrates the wisdom of the old adage, if you set out on a journey of revenge, be sure to dig 2 graves. Thank you.
So just to give a little taste of how much they vary, authoritarian elections vary across the world, I have a very short 20-second clip. This is on Algeria, right after their 2017 legislative elections. So I hope this plays. It should have been embedded. Okay, so I'll try to explain what goes on this video. So it's a much longer video. So where it's shown that regime employees are pretty much stuffing the ballot box. So there's like a large trash bag full of ballots behind her. She just takes them out and just stuffs them into this empty box. And there are multiple videos online like this from some of their non-governmental groups and activist groups. So that's one spectrum of electoral integrity across authoritarian regimes, where that's what we think of a lot of these authoritarian elections. We just think that lots of dictators just rig the numbers, rig the results, or rig the rules, use violence, so manipulate them to the extent where it's closer to rigging, not just manipulating. Whereas in countries like Kuwait, sort of on the other side of the spectrum, in terms of, at least in the authoritarian world, so Kuwait's elections, and at least, not just in the Gulf standard, but also in the regional standard, it's known to be very rather competitive and free and fair. It's actually a big deal, and many Kuwaitis are very proud of their parliamentary elections, how competitive they are, how free they are. So this is one of the examples where all the representatives, or most of the representatives of different political groups, they participate in the vote count process. They are invited to observe them to ensure the fairness. And this is a common knowledge to many Kuwaitis. At least when I conducted interviews in Kuwait, liberals, conservatives, Islamists, seculars, women, men, most people, everyone I interviewed at least, they argue or they know that elections are free and fair in Kuwait, and it's almost impossible, it would be impossible to rig them like what we saw in the Algerian case. Okay, so in case you have to leave early, I'll quickly summarize my argument before elaborating them. So my main research question in this book project is, why is fraud more common in some places? And I'm looking at 2 main factors to explain this variation in electoral quality. One is strong social cohesion. So I look at citizen networks and social cohesion in different countries to try to explain their effect on the level of fraud. Another is I look at the need for international support. Again, this varies in terms of how big the country is, how strong the government is, how strong the economy is. And I look at whether the need for international legitimacy also increases the need for making the elections look more clean and free and fair. So looking at the existing literature, going back a little bit, so as I mentioned, most of existing work in political science especially, for about a decade or 2 decades, scholars have looked at why dictators bother to hold elections, because we all know that it's not free and fair. Scholars have looked at various mechanisms through which dictators may benefit from elections. So the major consensus in the literature is that dictators hold elections because they benefit them. So they reap various benefits from elections, such as control of the inner elites, and also having ability to monitor local agents. Strengthening their international legitimacy, creating an easy network for distributing patronage, and so forth. So there are various ways through which dictators may benefit from holding elections. But again, the key assumption in all these explanations is that authoritarian incumbents, they must win before taking any of these benefits. So that's a major assumption, that they always win their elections. Yet we also know that holding elections itself also entails lots of risks. So because holding elections is costly, dictators of course have incentives to use fraud or manipulation to ensure their victory. And we know in history, even if they don't necessarily lose power as a result of losing elections, losing is very costly. So for example, in 2015, when Venezuela's opposition won the legislative elections, although the opposition won, but the power stayed within the Maduro regime, it was very costly and created lots of political instability. And of course, there's another example from the region when the Algerian Islamist opposition won at least the first round of elections before the civil war. And then there was a decade of civil war because the military stepped in. And we know in the end, the regime kept its power. It didn't lose power as a result of losing elections, but we know that losing itself was very costly. So regardless of whether they actually lose power, losing elections, we know from these various examples, it's very, very costly. So again, dictators have ample incentive to try to ensure their victory by using various fraudulent strategies. So then there's a puzzle. We also know that dictators use varying amounts of fraud. Again, seen, for example, in Algeria, where the regime, at least in the past, have resorted to blatant rigging of their elections and the results, whereas in some other countries where dictators avoid these blatant strategies, but rather opt out to more subtle manipulation tactics. So why is it that not all dictators use extensive fraud? So that's a major puzzle in my research. So again, looking at the first factor I look at, which is social cohesion and citizen network. So I argue that dictators are less likely to use fraud in the presence of strong social cohesion, namely in places where fraud is more likely to lead to anti-government protests. So to unpack this a little bit, because citizen networks and tight social cohesion, it facilitates the spread of information. And this information that's passed around within the citizen networks, it's more likely to be clean of regime manipulation. So unlike information they may receive from regime television stations or regime-controlled traditional media, it's harder for the regime to tightly control what people say to each other, in a sense, within a tightly cohesive society. So, for example, when there is an account of fraud, it's also likely to be passed to other citizens and other citizen networks faster in this case. And in turn, informed citizens are going to be more likely to engage in collective action against the regime. And again, we also know from like Eastern European countries in the late 80s and early 90s, fraudulent elections and even allegations of fraud, it becomes a great focal point to bring people together. So this, I mean, we are all aware of collective action problems, and often instances of fraudulent elections, it really helps citizens overcome this collective action problems. So that's why this information network is even more crucial. So I mean, just to note, in a sense that my theoretical framework is different from, for example, Putnam's, where he's looking more at social trust, lowering cost of collective action. I'm looking more at spread of information. So another factor I look at is the need for foreign support, or the need for international legitimacy. So I'm arguing that in countries that interact more heavily with global community, or leaders that place greater value on receiving international support, they are less likely to resort to fraud, because they know that it's an international norm nowadays to hold clean and fair elections. And if they don't do that, it's going to, make them lose support in the international communities. And of course, it not just about like economic intertwinedness, but it also has to do with other foreign policy threats, and especially some existential threats will make countries more, they would value international support more, and thus clean elections more. So I'll be using the case of Kuwait as evidence. And just to point out a couple relevant facts about Kuwait, I'm glad this is a crowd where I don't have to go too much into like where Kuwait is and what kind of regime it is. So it was formerly a British protectorate until 1961, and it's a monarchy, but with elected 50-member National Assembly. Again, as I mentioned, they are elected through very competitive elections. Candidates engage in heavy campaigning. It's really something that's specific to Kuwait, at least in the Gulf. And they're also known for their clean elections, at least relatively, especially in the regional standards. And I will look at two factors specific to Kuwait that have contributed to this low levels of fraud. One is there are multiple existential threats from Iraq at its independence and also in 1990, and throughout history in general. And also its social cohesion facilitated by Diwaniyas, which is a very unique social institution in Kuwait. So to begin with Diwaniya, it refers to a place of social gathering. It often looks like this. It's a room where it's a physical space where often men gather to, drink tea and have discussions about various topics, not limited to politics, but also the economy, culture, society, about their families. And Diwaniya also refers to the practice of gathering itself. So it's not, it doesn't just exist in Kuwait. It originates from tribal culture, but it is unique to Kuwait in a sense that it's very much heavily embedded in its everyday culture and everyday life. And many people I talk to in Kuwait will say that it's part of their everyday life. And again, this is also one of the cultural factors that Kuwaitis are very proud of. And there are different types of Diwaniya. So there are political ones organized by different political groups. There are Diwaniya specific for business purposes, and also family Diwaniya also for friends and family. So they used to be mostly male dominated, but more and more there are co-ed Diwaniya and also women's Diwaniya. So it has Diwaniya, they have played some key roles in many Kuwaiti affairs throughout in the last couple decades. One famous one being during the 2006 Orange Movement, which was a series of mass demonstrations Kuwait experienced, where people demanded political reform mainly. And Diwania, this Orange Movement and demands for reforms, it was a very hot topic in every Diwania where participants gathered to either whether they supported it or opposed it. It was one of the very common topics in these days. So Diwanias cover major events in Kuwait, and especially they also current events, what things that are discussed currently. And again, in my interviews, many refer to Diwania as a factor that stops the regime from, or that prevents the regime from rigging elections, because this is one of the places where everyone would find out that the regime is, involved in such behaviors. So I would love to talk more about this in the Q&A if there are any questions. And it is also, so something else that is unique to Kuwait is the Iraqi threats that are almost existential in Kuwaiti history. So starting and even before independence, but especially after the British departure in 1961, so Iraq demands annexation of Kuwait. They move troops to their border. The Soviet Union initially vetoed Kuwait's bid for the UN membership. So at this time, there are, many archival accounts where the emir sought international legitimacy and international recognition that they are a sovereign state by creating inclusive political institutions. So creating a constitution post-independence that specifically illustrated these inclusiveness of Kuwaiti political institution was key to Kuwait, making itself known as a sovereign state. Another account is the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. So a few years before Iraqi invasion, so before 1990, it wasn't that the Kuwaiti political culture was always very stable. In 1967, there were some major accounts of electoral fraud, again, which was heavily discussed in Diwania, and these major accounts of fraud never happened again since then. Partially thanks to Diwania and how and social cohesiveness in Kuwait that, made it a big deal, made it a widely known, something the regime did that everyone knew. And ever since then, the regime has been very careful in not blatantly rigging the elections. But that said, there were other smaller, there were other political instability in the country. The emir often suspended the National Assembly. The recent one, well, at least prior to the Iraqi invasion, being in 1986. So between 1986 and the Iraqi invasion, and until after the Iraqis had left, there were no parliament in Kuwait because it was suspended. But during the invasion in 1990, so the Kuwaiti royal ruling elites had fled the country. Many of them had fled the country, and a lot of them pledged to the international community that if they were to be back ruling Kuwait, they would ensure democratic, begin their democratic, process again. And it was a major pledge they made to the international community that they would continue, they would institute their parliament and really ensure the democraticness of them. So again, in accordance to their pledge, after liberation, elections in Kuwait, they were indeed reinstituted, and they've become more competitive than ever. So one other thing I want to reiterate is that just because there is no fraud, that doesn't mean it's perfectly clean and fair and free and fair. Of course, knowing that they can no longer just blatantly rig the elections, Kuwaiti ruling family and the elites have adopted other more subtle methods. So Thank you, that's perfect. So them being, major ones being changing election rules. So instead of rigging elections, they're manipulating the electoral institutions and electoral rules to control them to their favor. Again, by no means they stopped, they let the elections be completely free and fair. So another part of the argument in this chapter is that there are many possible manipulation strategies, ranging from more severe ones like stuffing the ballot boxes, engaging in electoral violence, also vote buying, and to more subtle ones being changing election rules to favor the pro-regime candidates, for example. And again, I am aware that not all of these techniques are always adopted by the regime. For example, rich candidates may engage in vote buying. But at least in my framework, what I focus on is the regime-initiated fraudulent strategies. So that said, one of my arguments is that these strategies are partial substitutes. So meaning, if a country is engaging more in blatant fraud, they would be less worried about changing election rules to favor themselves. But in countries like Kuwait, where they cannot really actively engage in fraud, they will resort more to more subtle strategies that could still benefit the regime. So again, the evidence is that Kuwait has changed its electoral law many, many times. So Kuwait, before in the 60s and 70s, they had 10 districts, and citizens had 5 votes each. And then there was a major electoral reform where 10 districts were divided up into 25 districts, and this time citizens were given 2 votes, and then it changed to 5 districts, 4 votes, and now it's 5 districts and 1 vote. So this is a lot of major electoral reforms that happened in a very short period of time. I mean, knowing that most other countries, it's really difficult. They rarely make these major changes to their electoral institutions. So to sum up, I looked at why fraud may be more common in some dictatorships rather than others, and I've somewhat demonstrated that there are varying levels of fraud across autocracies. So I do this more so in my book project, and I looked at the need for foreign support and strong social cohesion as factors that decrease the use of fraud. And possible policy recommendation that comes out of this is, we know that there are lots of election monitoring NGOs out there, but perhaps what's more important than just looking at events on the election day, perhaps the international communities also need to look at civil life and ensuring active civil society and citizen cohesion in order to facilitate this, democratization attempts. So another case I look at in my book is Algeria, as I've mentioned, and I did some preliminary fieldwork in Morocco earlier this year to perhaps add Morocco to sort of expand the regime types in order to look at, so that they're not a factor that's explaining these variation. So if there are any questions, I would love to talk more about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professors Hitman, Taylor, Lynch, and No. Fascinating presentations here. This concludes this panel entitled Expressions of State Policy in the Gulf in the 2019 Annual Conference of the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa. So please join me in a round of applause.